Good evening, everybody. I think we should get started as it's just gone 6. Welcome back to our series of lectures on the psychology of religion. For the next 4 sessions, we will be considering various approaches to our central question, which you might remember from last week. Why are people religious? What you, I hope, will notice over the course of these next sessions is that approximately the same ideas tend to return, albeit in modified form, again and again. Indeed, most of the ideas we will cover in 4 sessions can be found in this first one. Perhaps I should not have said that. Let's see if attendance numbers decline after today. Most of the session today will be spent looking at a few ancient, medieval, and early modern theories. We will then consider whether theological and atheological agendas sometimes, and perhaps even always, come with theories of religion. Finally, I will make some brief remarks about the kinds of evidence brought to bear on theories in the centuries before what we now call the scientific revolution. This seems a good time to acknowledge the lack of diversity among the thinkers we will be covering. For the first 4 lectures, every single person mentioned will be a male of European descent. In some ways, perhaps this is unsurprising. We are tracing the development of a field of research as it evolved in Europe and North America, which today remain the main loci for this work. And in this social context, it is only quite recently that women and non-white scholars like myself have had a look in. On the other hand, the scope of this series was entirely within my control, and I could have chosen to take detours into other intellectual cultures, especially from the Islamic world and East Asia. But I sacrificed this opportunity for increasing diversity on the altar of neatness. Honestly, I'm still not sure that I've made the right decision here. The cast of the 5th lecture focused on recent research in this area will be much more equitably diverse, I hope. Indeed, some of the most important recent work have been done by women. But until then, let's get started on our first of many, many European men we will encounter in the next few weeks. The first documented hypothesis about where religious beliefs come from in the human mind comes from Xenophanes of Colophon, born nearly 2,600 years ago. His work survives mostly in fragments, as you can see here, as well as in quotations by later thinkers who certainly held him in high esteem. Xenophanes is best known as a critic of Hesiod and Homer, who wrote the epic poems about the gods that still inspire books and films even now. As you will recall, Hesiod's and Homer's gods were rather like human beings, and perhaps even more fickle and capricious than we are. Xenophanes found such depictions of the gods crude and impious, arguing instead for a transcendent god, utterly perfect and well above the fray of petty human affairs. Some scholars argue that Xenophanes was a pioneering Greek monotheist, but this is a controversial reading. In any case, his early account of a supreme deity would eventually come to influence even Abrahamic monotheism, not least through Plato and Aristotle. Having denied the existence of the Homeric gods, Xenophanes wanted to account for why so many people believed in them anyway. As we can see here, his theory is essentially that there is something inherently narcissistic, if that's the right word, about sentient creatures, or perhaps we lack imagination and therefore project our own traits to others, including to the gods. In other words, we anthropomorphize the gods, creating them in our own image. And as we shall see, this idea that humans have a tendency to anthropomorphize things will prove to have great staying power. Next, we fast forward about 400 years to the Epicurean poet-philosopher Lucretius, whose work was despised by church fathers and early medieval Christian thinkers, but nevertheless survived thanks to some particularly open-minded or perhaps cheeky monks who continued copying and preserving his work, especially the treatise boldly called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, composed in over 7,000 dactylic hexameters. We would now call Lucretius a materialist, believing as he did that everything was made of atoms. Lucretius's atoms are not much like those of 21st century particle physics, but are nevertheless recognizable to us now. They are like imperceptibly small balls, which are the basic constituents of all things. This includes even the things that most others might consider spiritual things, like souls or gods. Unlike Xenophanes, Lucretius did not disbelieve in the gods, but like Xenophanes, he insisted that they were quite unlike human beings, who are needy and otherwise pathetic. Lucretius thought that the gods mostly ignored the rest of the cosmos, existing in perpetual contentment and peace. He certainly did not think that the slings and arrows of outrageous fortunes were the work of the gods, as many of his contemporaries insisted, who maintained belief in the Homeric gods. Rather, Lucretius believed in the gods, but nevertheless proposed a theory for how these beliefs came to be. He first posits that dreams play a crucial role, and that people are prone to infer that what is dreamed is also real. But he doesn't spend much time on this part of his theory. More important to him is why people attributed to the gods the varied workings of nature. The central thesis is that people are ignorant and afraid, and so jumps to the conclusion that the natural world, the weather and seasons especially, are controlled by the gods. In particular, they are ignorant of the true causes of natural phenomena, which are collisions between atoms. Lucretius's atomistic philosophy is therefore the science that banishes superstition, if you like. Now, you would think that St. Paul would be the opposite of Lucretius, and in some ways he is. But he also thinks that people readily attribute the existence and functioning of the natural world to the gods, or to God. But unlike Lucretius, he does not believe this attribution to be mistaken. This is not the only Christian account of the origins of religion, but it is in some ways the most palatable to us now. Many Christian thinkers of the early centuries of the church argued that religious beliefs were the work of demons. Here, Justin Martyr is saying that pagan gods are in fact demons, which people worship out of ignorance, filled in by diabolical deceit. As Athenagoras argues, who sounds rather a lot like Lucretius in this quote. Tertullian makes a similar case here, but specifies what the demons are mendaciously taking credit for, not so much the workings of the natural world, but for human skill in various arts. Now, let's skip 1,000 years of Christendom, though I should say that not all Christian thinkers thought in this way. Nor do I want to give the impression that such diabolical theories went away in the Middle Ages. In the 15th century and later, when Jesuit missionaries arrived in the New World, many of them said much the same thing about the religious beliefs of the people they encountered there, including especially in China, India, and the Americas. Working in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas held the view that there is something like a natural instinct towards both knowledge of and desire for God. He takes this in part from Augustine, who famously wrote that our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Later writers like Blaise Pascal will end up taking this even further to talk about an innate craving for God. As we shall see, something like this idea will persist even into the 20th century. The language of a God-shaped hole in our hearts is now commonly heard in churches. This view also seems to have crossed over to the Protestant side of things, though Calvin's psychology of religion is somewhat ambivalent. John Calvin argues for an innate sense of deity or seed of religion that explains the universality of religion, but also claims that this incipient knowledge is corruptible and indeed most often, if not universally, corrupted, so much so that he elsewhere calls the human mind a factory of idols. The language of corruption has a moralizing tone and is undoubtedly deliberate. Calvin has a theological agenda here. The innateness of the sensus divinitatis, the sense of divinity, means that, as St. Paul says earlier in his letter to the Romans, people are without excuse for unbelief. And the fact that we have corrupted this gift of the seed of faith means that we are doubly to blame for our unbelief. This view, which places much responsibility on the shoulders of believers and unbelievers, is in contrast with another Protestant reformer who, as it were, lays the blame, though he would not use the word, squarely on God Almighty. Zwingli's view is that God does not sow the seed of faith equally among people. Some are blessed with the fullness of truth, and others merely with partial and even distorted truth. This view seems to attribute unfairness to God, but also affirms God's sovereignty in all things. Now, there is something dissatisfying about this talk of instincts as an explanation for religious belief. It reminds me of the criticism of Aristotle that his explanations are sometimes tautologous. The famous example, which I believe we owe to the 17th century Parisian playwright Molière, is that of opium. When asked why opium causes drowsiness, an Aristotelian might say that it is because opium contains dormitive virtue or sleepy-making powers. But this does not seem very informative at all. Likewise, to say that religion is universal among human beings because human beings have a religious instinct does not seem to take us very far. Since Darwin, biologists and psychologists think of instincts in evolutionary terms and demand that whenever we posit an instinct, we must further provide an account of how that instinct came to be in our evolutionary past. No such account is forthcoming from our medieval and early modern theorists, and so their theories are found wanting in modern terms. Perhaps this is asking too much of our pre-Darwinian theorists who do not share these demands and expectations. We do not have to wait for Darwin to encounter evolutionary thinking of a sort, however. The last thinker we will consider today is in some ways really a modern thinker, and arguably the first truly modern theorist of religion, as opposed to being the last medieval or early modern one. We will spend a bit more time than on the others on David Hume and his Natural History of Religion, published in 1757. And it remains one of my own very favorite books on religion, despite its very many flaws, most of which are shared by his contemporaries and forebears. Unlike all the other thinkers we have considered, Hume's theory is expressed in book-length form. It is, in other words, a fully developed and articulated theory. As we shall discuss further later, Hume also takes the time and space to provide evidence for his theory, such as it is. The theory begins, much as Lucretius's did, with an uncertain and dangerous world upon which human beings depend, but whose causes are invisible. This is a potent and fecund concoction, the precarity of human life, our reliance on the natural world, the mysteriousness of its operations. In these circumstances, human beings are necessarily curious, not as a matter of intellectual fancy, but as a matter of sheer survival. We need to figure the world out, and in the course of trying to do so, the gods are born. But why were the gods the preferred explanation? For Hume, it is no accident that we conjure up gods to explain the cosmos, nor is, with respect to Lucretius, the combination of ignorance and fear sufficient, though both are certainly in operation, as we have just seen in these quotes. Hume posits an instinct, but not an instinct for religion as such. It is old Xenophanes' anthropomorphic instinct, resurrected for his purposes. Hume does not provide an evolutionary explanation of this instinct, but does at least provide some evidence for it, by way of examples that he believes, probably rightly, that will be very relatable by his readers. We do see faces in clouds and hear voices in the wind. We do attribute the capacity for love to even our dumbest pets, and we attribute malice to inanimate objects like vending machines and printers, perhaps especially to printers. These are, for Hume, not the printer example, obviously, these are, for Hume, the psychological building blocks of religion, a tendency to anthropomorphize combined with a desperate desire to make sense of the world. From this foundation easily comes varieties of animism and polytheism, examples of which fill the pages of Hume's book. For Hume, it is animism and polytheism which are the starting point of religion. But Hume is not satisfied to stop there. He wants to explain monotheism as well as the religions widely disparaged by his contemporaries as primitive and savage. His is an equal opportunity explanatory project. Monotheism, Hume goes on to argue, comes from polytheism and animism. God with a capital G comes from gods with a small g. Gods start small, but grow, according to Hume, fed by flattery. Either to curry favor with their gods or to talk smack against rival tribes and their deities, the power and majesty of the gods are inflated over and over again until it is claimed that God is infinite in power and majesty. Incidentally, something like this probably did happen among the ancient Israelites. Most biblical scholars now think that the religion of ancient Israel was polytheistic before it became monotheistic. And in between, Israelites may have acknowledged the existence of other gods, but only worshipped one. Over time, the powers and attributes of foreign gods were assimilated into those of the God of Israel, not least as cultures clashed, and there was impetus to assert that Yahweh was stronger than Baal or Molech or Astarte. This kind of theological one-upmanship can be seen in Hebrew biblical texts when they are compared against analogous texts from other parts of the ancient Near East. In many cases, these different scriptures seem to be modified versions of one another, designed to compete with one another. And so Hume may have been right about Hebrew monotheism. Whether or not he was right to generalize about monotheism more generally is harder to say. After all, monotheism did not only evolve in the ancient Near East. There's evidence of ancient monotheism around Mongolia too, and perhaps also in South Asia. There is much more to be said about and for Hume's Natural History of Religion, and I do commend the book to you. I read it almost once a year myself, which I confess is more than I read the whole Bible, but we must leave it for now to pick up a few threads about theory, ideology, and evidence. I hope you have noticed already my attempts to say something about the theological agendas and motivations of the thinkers we have encountered. Paul, the church fathers, the medieval schoolmen, and the Protestant reformers were all Christians, of course, but had slightly different access to grind. Those of you who know your New Testaments might recall that Paul was quite keen to appeal to the pagans, whom he argued had the truth inside them already, manifested in, for example, the worship of the unknown God at Areopagus. His idea that the handiwork of God could be seen by all in nature is consistent with this evangelistic strategy. Justin Martyr and the other church fathers were perhaps living in a more hostile environment, where Paul's gentler, friendlier strategy gave way to outright hostility against pagan religion. They were thus keen to prove their opponents wrong, and their explanations of pagan belief were designed accordingly. Recall that the church fathers reckoned demons duped dumb pagans into their pagan beliefs. Calvin's ideas about the corruptibility of the sensus divinitatis may have been targeted at Roman Catholics in particular, who had, on this view, corrupted the Christian truth into superstitious nonsense. And Zwingli's concern to preserve the sovereignty of God has already been mentioned. And so you see, the different theological agendas have something to do with and perhaps shaped the theories of religion expressed. It is somewhat more difficult to say what Thomas Aquinas' motivations were for positing a religious instinct. In some ways, it was an inconvenient view for him, who argued that the existence of God was not self-evident, though it could be inferred rationally from the existence of contingent things. Thomistic scholars more learned than I might be able to enlighten me on this point. In any case, what all these Christian thinkers shared in common was monotheism, and you might have noticed that their explanations of monotheism were not at all unflattering. It is no disparagement of people to say that they saw God in the beauty of creation, or that they possessed a God-given instinct towards faith. It is theories about pagan gods that were, to our ears, remarkably offensive. Furthermore, the innocuous and even positive accounts of monotheism they provided are barely explanations at all. Upon closer inspection, they basically assert that people believe in God because God indeed exists. They rightly infer God's handiwork in creation, or are the beneficiaries of God's gracious gift of an instinct towards faith. In other words, we might characterize this explanatory strategy as saying that we believe what we believe because our beliefs are true and therefore do not really require explanation. Only false beliefs demand explanation. And so those who believe falsely believe thus because they are ignorant and deceived by evil spirits. Nor is Hume really exempt from this analysis that explanations of religion are very often explanations of other people's religion. But he takes an equal opportunity approach because, as it were, all religion is other people's religion for Hume. Not all scholars think that Hume was an atheist per se, but he is certainly very close to being one, despite a few pious platitudes scattered amongst his writings to get the religious authorities off his back, no doubt. For the record, if you ask me, Hume was an atheist, and accusations of deism are exaggerated. Now, I don't know if the tendency to infuse theory with ideology is an entirely avoidable one, but it is worth watching out for if we are to have any shot at avoiding it. Modern theories, which we will get onto in later lectures, are on the whole naturalistic theories, which keep gods out of the explanations themselves. One could argue, and some have done, that these theories are inherently hostile against religious belief. Don't know if that's quite right, actually. What bracketing out supernatural explanations does is that it makes it possible for scholars to discuss the matter regardless of our personal views. This does have its limits, of course. Scholars who insist that naturalistic explanations are exhaustive may well, depending on theology, come across as unduly ideological. It is a vexed issue, not easily solved, but we will come to such matters in greater detail in our final lecture of the series. Finally, then, what role has evidence played in pre-modern theorizing? This is an important question because, at its best, empirical evidence can falsify our prejudices. It is fair to say, I think, that anything resembling what social scientists would now call evidence is sorely lacking for most of the thinkers we have encountered so far. Ancient and medieval thinkers sometimes appealed to common sense and arguments by analogy, and there are plenty of citations of other thinkers with much weight put on the venerable ideas of respected forebears. These were acceptable sources of authority in those days, according to their canons of evidence and argument. Even Thomas Aquinas's argument, who is nothing if not reasonable, is not really an empirical one, appealing to observable evidence. Elsewhere, he does argue for the inclination towards good, largely on Aristotelian grounds. We eat when we hunger, he observes. Plants grow towards sunlight, and these inclinations are taken as evidence for an inclination towards good, which for Aquinas and Aristotle has a lot to do with what is good for us. Eating is good for animals, sunlight is good for plants, and an orientation, behavior towards those things that are good for them are evidence of this inclination. So the argument goes for Aquinas that as God is the greatest good, we must have an inclination towards God as well, just as plants have an inclination towards sunlight and animals have an inclination towards food. This is an empirical generalization of sorts. In contrast, by the time we reach Hume, however, we begin to see traces of a scientific mindset. After all, he was writing well over a century after Galileo pointed a telescope into the night sky to challenge Aristotle's and Ptolemy's centuries-long hegemony in astronomy. But quite unlike Galileo, Hume never made his own observations. His book does contain many observations of peoples from different cultures, but they are all second-hand. His main sources were classical, as was standard for the day. Like everyone else, he knew his Hesiod and Homer well and used them extensively. He relied on ancient Greek and Latin historians and naturalists too, who still carried a lot of sway back then, many centuries later. And to their credit, many of these men, like Herodotus, were well-traveled and were keen observers of human behavior. Hume's other sources were the products of the age of discovery, beginning in the 15th century, when explorers, traders, and missionaries began exploring the world beyond the European West. It is from them that Hume learns about people in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. And it is thanks to them that he can provide some texture on the religious beliefs and practices of people far away from himself. Reliance on second-hand sources is not itself problematic. This method would continue well into the 19th and 20th centuries, as we shall see. Even now, social scientists still rely a lot on other people's observations, as we cannot go everywhere ourselves. But reliance on second-hand data is risky, as the reliability of the data is difficult to assess. There was, in Hume's time, not very much data, and much of it was unreliable, sullied by prejudice and political and religious agendas. Some of it was collected by the aforementioned Jesuit missionaries who rehashed those ancient theories attributing pagan belief to demons. Furthermore, Hume's method is not demonstrably to lay out all the available data and then to infer patterns from them. This is less possible for anthropological data than, say, for astronomical data. By the time Copernicus and Galileo were working, there were already standard tables of the locations and movements of stars. So everyone who was theorizing about the arrangements of the celestial bodies were theorizing from more or less the same data. Not so in the 18th century when it comes to observations about religion from cultures around the world. This lack of standardization lends itself to cherry picking. Whether or not things have improved in the intervening 2.5 decades, we shall have to wait to see. It is worth saying, however, that efforts have been made in the last 50 years or so to create large databases of anthropological data, which can then be used to test hypotheses. One of the largest of these is called the Human Relations Area File, which contains detailed information about well over 100 diverse societies. More recently, rival teams in the United Kingdom and in Canada have constructed the Global History Data Bank, named Seshat after the Egyptian goddess of measurement, and the Database of Religious History, respectively. Both of these projects are large repositories of anthropological information from across cultures and also through time. As these grow and become more diverse, they will become more and more useful for testing theories about religion, the same way that medieval catalogues of stars were useful for testing theories about planetary motion. Next week, we begin in the 19th century, tipping into the 20th. Right. Thank you very much for listening to the second lecture of this series. As we did last week, I thought it would be good to, if you either typed your questions and comments in the comments box, or if you like, you can just turn your mics back on and ask your questions live. I'll deal first with Martin's comment about whether or not Aquinas was talking teleologically. So yes, so the point of talking about an instinctive desire and drive towards the good and God in particular is precisely his theory of the various teloi that human beings, but also all creatures have. In sort of modern times now, we think of teleology almost purely in normative terms, right? So when we say that that such and such an object or so and so a person has a certain teleology, we're talking about what they ought to do, right? Almost in kind of moral terms. But for Aquinas, and in fact still for in sort of Catholic moral theology, it's also a descriptive theory, right? It says something about our moral psychology. There's something in us that drives us towards a certain direction or gives us knowledge towards a certain direction. So it's not just normative. One of the great things I think about Catholic moral theology, about Aristotelian moral psychology and moral philosophy, is that the normative and the descriptive kind of come together. In some ways, this cleavage between the normative and the descriptive, between is and ought, really owes itself to Hume, mentioned today already in the lecture. So yes, of course, Aquinas was talking teleologically, but for the purposes of this lecture, I'm alluding to the descriptive component of his teleological theory.
I understand exactly what you're saying, but I mean, my understanding from what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I probably am, is that he is saying that, plants reach for sunlight, plants need water in order to become, better plants, bigger plants, and fulfill themselves. And what he is attributing to humanity is, my understanding again, is that automatically we are reaching for God, like a plant reaching for sunlight, and that is inherent, and I don't believe it is. Although I was brought up a Catholic, I hasten to add.
Yes, I mean, whether we think he's right is a separate thing. But yes, you've summarized what I take to be Aquinas's view perfectly. Like, I think that's exactly what he's saying, is that we have an inherent, inborn, innate, whatever word you like, instinct towards God in exactly the same way, or at least in analogously the same way that plants reach toward the sun. Now, again, whether or not he's right, or whether Hume is right, or whether Xenophanes is right, or for that matter, whether Justin Martyr is right, I leave for the moment, except to say that as I mentioned earlier, at least by the evidential standards of the 21st century, Aquinas's account does not count as scientific. He is very much arguing by analogy, as opposed to adducing any direct evidence that there is any such thing as an inclination towards religious belief. I mean, like many people of the Middle Ages, he knew that there were people with religious beliefs who were not themselves Christians or Jews. I mean, like, he knew of Muslims, for example, and of course he knew of pagans. So it's not as though Aquinas is himself ignorant that there is religion in other parts of the world, and he could draw on that as partial evidence, at least, of his what Calvin eventually calls the sensus divinitatis. But it is also the case that as I mentioned during the lecture, there's a tension here between this view and his insistence that Anselm is wrong, that theism, that belief in God, is not logically self-evident, that it isn't that contemplating the idea of God doesn't just generate the belief itself. And you might think that if Aquinas thought that we all have an inclination towards belief in God, you might think that that gives him a way into a kind of Anselmian position, which is that once you think about what it means to believe in God, you sort of will believe in God. But that's not the route that Aquinas takes. I've never really been sure why that's the case.
Silence.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any questions about the various early theories we've covered today. This might be an early night for us, if not. I will say, for the most part, I will be withholding judgment about whether I think such and such a theory is reasonable or true or right. Although I will occasionally comment about the extent to which the evidence justifies the theory. We will mostly be considering them at the level of the ideas until we come toward the sort of latter part of the series, in large part because that's when people bother adducing evidence for their ideas. Right. Yes, Nico.
Yeah, it's not necessarily related to tonight's, but maybe a bit more to last week's, Jonathan. The thing which crossed my mind is that I wasn't too sure whether any experimentation had been done on measurement of people's brain activity, whether that could be correlated with any religious feelings, and if so, if that research would have shown that religious feelings might also correspond with other brain activity, which triggered by other events, and it would be interesting to know what these other events might be, which show similar responses.
Yeah, so I will say more about that during our penultimate lecture when I consider 21st century theories and approaches to the study of religion. But I do think something about how brain scans work might be helpful now. So if you were to put somebody in a brain scanner, as we say colloquially, really a functional MRI, whenever anyone does anything, basically your whole brain lights up, right? So how we then try to figure out which part of the brain is specifically recruited or involved in any particular process or phenomenon is to then compare what you're doing at any given time with and your brain is being scanned at the time with a kind of control condition, right? So we might get you to rest, so like sort of do nothing and think about as little as possible, and then we tell you to, move your left pinky or something like this, right? And then we see that in both cases, when you're doing nothing and when you're moving your left pinky, the brain scans look very similar, right? Which is that your whole brain is active in both cases, right? But then when we take away the control condition from the experimental condition, the sort of pinky moving condition, we can then see exactly which parts are uniquely involved in the moving of the pinky that was not as active when you were doing nothing, right? So, okay, so this raises a kind of problem for comparing religious experiences with other kinds of experiences, I think, because then you need sort of three conditions, right? So you need the kind of religious experience condition, see what the brain is doing when you have a religious experience, and the short answer is your whole brain is lighting up, right, in a certain sort of way, and then you might have the kind of quasi-religious experience. Say, last week's example was, say you're watching your favorite football team, win an important match, right? And then again, the short answer is that your whole brain lights up again, right? And the third condition is the relevant control, and again, your whole brain lights up, and then you have to statistically remove the final image from the first two, and then you have to compare those two with one another, right? But then when you do that, what you actually end up getting is the bits that are unique, right? Because they will share lots and lots and lots in common, right? Because, for example, they will share memory in common and consciousness in common and language in common. So like it is much more difficult to find what two phenomena have in common than it is to find what they have as a matter of difference, simply because whenever we do anything, the whole brain lights up. The whole brain is active when you do anything at all. So the studies about whether or not X is a bit like Y, like these are just difficult to do with the technology that we have. That's not to say that this necessarily stops neuroscientists from arguing that X is a bit like Y, right? But these tend to be in different studies. So for example, you can have one study where you have a control condition and someone watching a football match, and then you have a different study where you have someone having a religious experience and then a control condition. And then someone notices, wait a second, the two brain scans look very similar, right? And then someone will argue, well, you know, it must mean that they're very similar neurologically. But that is so this is called reverse inference. This kind of argument, and it's deeply problematic simply because any number of phenomena share the same brain activity in common with a whole bunch of other brain phenomena. So it is just extremely equivocal, the argument, and it is very hard to get away from the limitations of neuroimaging research, because that's just how the technology, well, that's how the technology works, but it's just also how the brain works, right? Like we're used to seeing in newspapers, oh, you know, this part of the brain is the whatever, the God spot or something like this, as if the rest of your brain is asleep, right? And only that part of the brain is activated, but that's just not how it works. So it's a hard question to answer, but I will try to say something about neuroscience studies on religion, and in particular religious experiences later on in the fifth lecture. I am also just much more comfortable with that period because it happens to be mine. Whereas all the historical stuff is, I think, important because we often forget that the ideas come from somewhere. But you know, it is, the less scientific something is, the harder it is for me to get my teeth into it, really. I think that probably is the last question for the evening, in which case I'll be very pleased to see you all next week when we will consider sort of late 19th and first half of the 20th century theories, including especially Freud and Jung toward the end of that lecture. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Have we noticed that we're back to front? Isn't it odd?
We are odd.